Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this Scrum Inc. Distributed Teams webinar. My name is Tom Bullock. I am a product owner here with Scrum Inc. And I just want to start with a few things because I will be facilitating the question portion of this webinar, which will come at the end, though we may take some questions that we've received in advance throughout this webinar. If you would like to give us a question, please put it in the chat function. We will be monitoring it. We have, as you can see, 1,000 participants, over 1,000 participants. So we'll be grouping questions into themes since there's no way we'll be able to answer them all. So please, though, put your questions in and we will keep track of it and try to group them thematically. The second thing I'd like to mention is we will be recording this webinar. As always, our webinars are posted afterwards. They're free to access afterwards. We'll be sending out an email to everyone that includes that link to where you can find this recorded webinar for on-demand viewing, and also the checklist that we talked about that will help tell you how best to use the Scrum events for distributed teams, and also how best to select tools to make sure you have the communication you need for distributed teams to be effective, aligned, and focused. Now, distributed teams are a reality. We've seen this growing for quite some time, but right now there's a lot of interest in distributed teams out of necessity. With something like a now just announced global pandemic, unfortunately, distributed teams may become a way of working that people need to deal with more quickly. And we have a lot of experience with distributed teams, which is why we're giving this free webinar. I myself, again, I'll be facilitating this. I'm in North Carolina at the moment. Jeff is in Boston. Say hi to everyone, Jeff.
Hi, everyone.
And then JJ, who is also our co-host, he is in the United Kingdom right now. And I just want to remind it before I hand this over to JJ, I'd like to remind everyone who we have. Dr. Jeff Sutherland is, of course, the co-creator of Scrum, an Agile manifesto co-signer, and the founder of Scrum Inc. He's also a best-selling author, as is JJ Sutherland. He is also our CEO of Scrum Inc. And JJ, I'll hand it over to you now. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Just so everyone knows, I am sitting in a Marriott in the United Kingdom, and even though I got the enhanced internet, it is very slow and has time to chop up. So I'm just going to turn off my video, if that's all right with everybody, just so I conserve bandwidth. So we've all had an introduction to remote work and how it's been challenging. We've been doing this for quite a while at Scrum Inc., but you know what really can be happening, and I've been talking to a lot of people about this. You know, everyone is used to working in the same place, and that is patterns of communication, patterns of connection, patterns of how people work together. And when you're suddenly isolated, suddenly working alone, it can be very hard to, you know, re-engage with your work. What am I doing? When do I work? How much do I work? How do I connect with people? And then also, I've spoken to a few people who have self-isolated themselves, and they say, you know, self-quarantining is really boring. And they feel sort of a sense of purposelessness. And you really need, and I think Scrum, and we'll go through this in this webinar, a pattern of living. So people know what they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it, how do they communicate with people, how do they know what to do? Because what you really want to avoid is everyone doing the same work or making things, you know, that no one wants. And there has to be some way of making things visible. Everybody actually doing what needs to be done. Those are the things, the challenges that we think you need to overcome. So we can move on. So.
Okay, we've done an incredible amount of research on remote teams. I remember back in 1996 when I took over what is now GE Healthcare, my highest performing team was a remote team. I'm on a remote team. Fortunately, I have a gigabyte wired internet connection, so it's extremely fast. When we started working with Microsoft's process group, they were doing studies on distributed teams at Microsoft, and of course they had thousands of them, not only internally, but with vendors. And the basic assessment was when you distribute, you introduce risk. You risk the success of a project. You risk increasing delivery time. You risk reducing team performance. And so in 2006, when I started working with Open Venture Partners and looked at their companies, all of which had remote teams, in various parts of the world, we set up a strategy for dealing with remote teams. First of all, we wanted to use them because we can get the best talent anywhere, wherever it is. In our ventures, we often want to scale up or even scale down quickly. That's more easily done with offshore teams. And sometimes, and I emphasize, sometimes the costs can be reduced. And since a lot of the expectation of the investors is costs will go down, we need some way to measure performance. We decided that we needed always to have a technical capability at the headquarters company. And our companies could be anywhere in the world, but wherever the headquarters is, there needs to be a technical Scrum team that can support and extend the product without any offshore help if they can't get it. We will also measure performance of teams offshore and onshore by introducing Backlog, similar Backlog, so that we can look at, are we getting performance as good offshore as onshore? And we know that's possible. We've done a tremendous amount of research on that. If it's not the same onshore and offshore, then we'll do some coaching interventions, try to figure out why. And systematically, as we deploy more teams, we'll deploy them where the highest quality and lowest cost is achieved simultaneously. And we have a checklist that we use for teams that we want to make sure teams are running in the right way. I'll come to that in a moment. When I did a tech talk for Google on AdWords, AdWords makes over 90% of Google's revenue. They are a set of co-located teams that are remote from one another. At the time I did that tech talk some years ago, they had 5 teams. And they had no means of communication between the teams other than email, voicemail. I asked them how well that was working. They said, not as well as it needs to. So what I recommended is they go to what we call a distributed scrum of scrums, that you have a regular scale daily scrum across the teams to make sure everybody's synchronized when you're working on the same product that need to be fully integrated. But one of the most interesting things we've done is published 6 papers on really high performing globally distributed teams where the teams are half in one location and half in another. And we show that even with a distributed daily meeting, if the teams are running really well, and you have to have more discipline distributed, if they're running really well, you can get the same performance as you can if the teams are co-located. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How can you do as well remote as you do when you're co-located? Here's some of the case studies that I mentioned. You can go to our Scrum Inc. website and see the Cersei Dynix case study, the Zebia case studies, systematic case studies. One of the things we found in the venture group is that while we can get very high performance with teams half in one location, half in another, it's harder to manage the environment. It's hard for the team. The teams have to be more disciplined. And we find if we co-locate teams, so at each point around the world, wherever the people are, they are a small team. That is a lot easier to manage, and we can get the same level of performance. Other companies have found that as well, and 2 that I've worked with that I know well, Cisco and Philips, have been systematically co-locating teams all over the world. So, you know, if the developers in India, they actually send the Scrum Master and the product owner to India, so they have them in one location. But then, of course, they have to communicate between teams across geographies. So that's a little bit about the background of the research. And the bottom line is that you can get the same performance distributed as local, but it requires doing it in a very specific way, which we're going to talk about.
Yeah, Jeff, had a conversation, or as a speech with the head of Agile at the Wikimedia Foundation a few years ago, and he told me that they have to be distributed because they're a nonprofit in San Francisco and can't afford to hire software engineers in San Francisco. So at that time, this is a few years back, at that time they're about 60% distributed. And he said what they've found is that co-location masks bad communication. So what he was saying is that you can be sloppy if you're all in the same room, but if you are distributed, you have to be more disciplined. And so this is a few patterns. These are the exact same patterns that anyone we transform in our transformation group, or anyone comes to one of our training courses, that we give everyone. And they're just as important, actually more important for remote teams than they are even for co-located teams. Small, stable teams, ready backlog that's visible to everybody. Teams that use yesterday's weather so they don't bring up too much stuff into the sprint. Cross-functional teams so they can do swarming. We'll talk more about swarming, but one of the things I've really noticed on my team, and my team is distributed all the time, and I've been at a daily stand-up where I'm on the street in Tokyo with an iPhone, someone's in Cambridge, another person's in California, another person is god-awful time in Europe. But by working on a common problem, we really breed that kind of team cohesiveness and feeling like you're on a team. Having some sort of way of dealing with interrupts, some sort of way of making sure you don't let defects go unfixed, using the Kaizen and the retrospective to really improve the team. And this is really important, especially if all of a sudden, I've seen the hashtag on Twitter, suddenly remote, is that you do a retrospective, you get together so you can say, wow, this is different. This, what's hard? How can we do an experiment to see how to make it better? And the happiness metric, and I'll go into this a lot more later, it's very easy when you're isolated to feel alone. And this is, a challenging time. We live in very interesting times. And so getting some way of checking on how happy your teams are and what's making them afraid or sad or frustrated is really important, because what you really want to do is make those remote teams feel like they are co-located. And so I think the real thing, I'm going to sort of split this into two areas. One is communication, like how to stay in touch, and the other is coordination, like, okay, you're communicated, how do you coordinate the effort? So let's go into communication first. So this is some research came out a few years ago from Oslo, and it measures the sort of the warmth of communication. And of course, the worst way for anyone to interact is by documents. Listen, I write books, and I have friends who are novelists, and even then, the writing, even through a chat tool or through text, is really the worst way of communicating any sort of complex idea, because of course you don't get feedback. And then it can be two people on email. That's a little bit better because it's interactive than two people on the phone. And I really encourage you, don't do conference calls on the phone, because I know what I do in conference calls, which is, what? I'm sorry, I was on mute, seeing where I'm gonna go out to eat that night. But video conference is the best way to do it. People at a whiteboard is even better, but really you wanna have video to go forward.
Whoops.
That's all right. So it's okay, but video is your friend.
Sorry,
don't worry about it.
You click through there.
Because it maintains a deeper connectivity, because just voice, you don't see a huge amount of the emotional state and the feelings of the person you're talking to. And so it creates a deeper connection. And because this is really deeply rooted in the human brain, that we evolved to read other humans' faces. Are we part of the group? Are we going to be accepted as part of the group? And they've done studies where newborns, like within a day or two, can distinguish between faces. And when you look at somebody, when you're being seen, you try to appear together, right? You want to keep yourself together and present, and you can, again, detect that mood. And we go on, I just want to show what we do at Scrum Inc. So this is from we have a scaled demo every Wednesday, and this is, a lot of our people are actually not here, But we just do this, and we look like the Brady Bunch every Wednesday. And what we do this because we want everyone across the company to be connected at a scaled level. It almost is more important that we're just there and talking rather than what we actually say. It really does breed a sense of we are all one team of teams. And it's really, really effective. So I would encourage you to do this. We use Zoom, but there's a gazillion video tools out there. Some of them are basically free. So I'd encourage you to experiment and see what works best for you. But this kind of video communication is really important. And if we go to the next slide, I want to just tell a story that I heard. Had nothing to do with it. I'd heard the story. This woman gave a talk a few years back. At the Federal Reserve, they were doing a project that was automatically taking the tax refunds of deadbeat dads in the United States. And I say United States because I've been seeing the people joining from Israel, from Ukraine, from Nigeria, from all over, which is fantastic. Over 1,000 people. This is great. So they, at the Federal Reserve, they had a team at the Treasury in Washington, D.C. They had a team at the Fed in Philadelphia, and they had a team at the Fed in San Francisco. So what they did with this woman who was the product owner at the Treasury, she had 2 really big TV screens put up in each location with always on web video. And they had one rule, which is you had to say hi if you saw someone in one of the TVs. And she said that it really just became like a window into another room, that everyone would come in and they would just talk. And it was just, they could even swarm through all of this. It just became like they were just there. And one of the keys, though, as long as video, the other kind of key, and this is probably the most important key communication in Scrum, in anything, a ready and transparent backlog. And we know that product backlog items are a placeholder for a conversation. So you put them in whatever your tool you're going to use so you can hold them so people can talk about them. One of the things we do see, sometimes some people have access to the tools, some people don't. And so you want to make sure everyone has the same access. Even if part of your team is still in the office and part of your team is remote, you want to make sure it feels the same. And you want to bring people together so they understand the backlog. They understand what is being tried to achieve, what's the sprint goal is from the product owner, but also what is discussed with their other team members so they can engage with the work. Don't let your definition of ready slip. I mean, distributed work, as I said before, requires more discipline. Make sure your stories are even more clear because conversations will be a little more difficult. You really need to engage with your backlog and really have a great backlog refinement. Now, I just want to mention one of our customers, Ali Interactive, and this is from their blog. I just took this from their blog because they are a completely remote company. They have no physical offices whatsoever. And they send, I don't know everybody, but just about everybody who's a new hire to our trainings. And they just posted this blog and saying there's a simple 3 things to do. You know, have the technology support for collaboration and frictionless, but secure, access to important resources. And then a culture of trust, inclusion, and making work visible. Because that transparency is what is the root of Scrum. And also in that transparency, you need people to be vulnerable, to be feeling, whether you're a leader or a team member, to a psychological safety to be able to express what your emotional state is, to be able to share your feelings, and you really need to work on making sure that your culture encourages that. Now, they found that how they phrase earnest and holistic implementation of Scrum creates practices that encourage this. And I was working with one of our customers this week in the UK, and this one woman was saying, well, why don't we talk about the culture more? Why are we talking about the framework? And I told her, and I think this really resonated with her, is the point of Scrum is not the framework. I mean, that all happens, but what the framework creates in the second and third order effects that kind of create this transparency and this kind of openness. And it's not easy, and you got to build this culture over time, but I really encourage you to do it and go check out their blog. They have a lot of really good thoughts there.
Swarming is one of the most important things that you can do in a Scrum team to get things moving faster. Okay, so I'm in my home office. I'm traveling all the time. So if I'm at home, I'm meeting from my home office. It's always a remote meeting with my team. I'm on a team. We decided a while back that we would try swarming on the video for 1 hour after the daily meeting, and our velocity immediately went up a significant amount. So when people are collaborating together, working together to solve a problem, it really not only makes things get done quicker and easier, but you get a better result. You get a higher quality result. And at the same time, it raises the happiness of the team. And we know that happier teams produce better stuff, higher quality. So swarming is a core of a really good team, which means more than one person working on a story at a time. So you need to set up your environment so that you can enable swarming, and you can do it. We mentioned the Federal Reserve had the always-on video. We work with other companies that have the same setup. You walk into a conference room, the video is always on. You can see somebody walking down the hall in India and say hello to them. Many companies have set up this environment that really enables people to collaborate and swarm together. Here's another one of our clients where a lot of the team is co-located, but some of them are not. So you can see they have one of their team members on video as part of their regular meeting and the Scrum events, and they're included in the team just like anyone else. So individuals and interactions or processes and tools, that's the first value statement of the Agile Manifesto. And in remote teams, those interactions are enabled by tools like we're using right now. There are hundreds of Scrum tools, and I've worked with many vendors. For example, version 1 was one of our investments at Overview. I spent a lot of time with them in the early days. Jira has dominant market share. My team is using Jira Next Gen, which we think is a significant improvement. And we are using the Nareva Span system in our training center so that everything is digital on the wall, and you can put sticky notes on the wall from your cell phone or from any tool, no matter where you are in the world. So one of the things I would like to see us move to is where our meetings are on the Nareva board. Jira automatically loads the backlog up as sticky notes on the Nareva board. We update the sticky notes, and then Nareva puts them back in Jira. So then we can do nothing but work on a board with sticky notes, and we never have to look at the tool at all. This is, in my view, is the nirvana of Scrum tooling.
But I want to say, Jeff, not all of our teams use that. We have a lot of experience working with Rally. Some of our customers, we used it for a little while ourselves. Some of our customers use it with version 1, as Dad mentioned. Some of our teams use Pivotal Tracker. That we've used that for a long time. We have teams that use Trello. I've heard really good things about Azure boards, Microsoft project, and about Microsoft Teams. I haven't used it myself, but I've heard really good things about it. We have one person in the company who's a really passionate advocate for LeanKit. And so there are a lot of tools out there, but what we really want to make sure is that you don't do what the tool tells you to do. You pick the tool that fits your workflow, because not all tools are really appropriate for all kinds of work. There are some tools that are really great for software development, and they have a bunch of stuff that's plugged in there for software development. But if you use it for another kind of work that's not software development, which is most of my customers, it can be restricting. So we're going to send you a checklist of all the things you should consider when you pick a tool. And we will, share that with you after the webinar when we send the email to you. So you'll get it, because wrapping yourself around the axle to do what a tool says rather than do what you think is important is, that's just silly. That's putting the robots in charge. Like, don't do it because the robots tell you to do it because it helps your work. So we also need, so those are sort of the ideas of how to communicate. And someone just put in chat, Reich is another one of those tools I've heard of a couple other people using it. But people need structure, because when you're working from home, which I've done on and off and on the road for, 8 years now. And you need some sort of structure to your day, because if you sit down at your dining room table or your home office and you start working, well, when do you start working? When do you stop? And one of the dangers is you never stop, as you keep on going. And what do you do, and what are you supposed to do? So I'm just going to go through the Scrum events real quick and talk about those. So the first thing is the sprint. And it's really the heartbeat of Scrum. We do 1 week sprints. I know people do most people do 2 week sprints. I know people do 3 week sprints. But what it does, I was talking to this group at Saab that does 3 week sprints. And I said, how do you figure it out? Like, where are you in the sprint? Because doing sprint planning for more than a week at this point would make my head explode. But he said, even with a 3 week sprint, this becomes the heartbeat. We know where we are in the sprint. We know exactly what day it is. And so the sprint, it defines the time, it defines progress, and gives you a rhythm of life. And it's really, it has a beginning, it has a middle, and it has an end. And it's a great sort of frame for your work and for your life. And then you really want to make sure that in that sprint, that remote workers feel connected. This is another one of our clients doing work where they had some people at home, some people in the office, and that might be happening to some of you right now. It's certainly happening to us here at Scrum Inc. And so, but they need to connect. I saw just in the chat that how much key the swarming is. And we're going to talk about swarming a lot, because that is what brings people together. So during that sprint, you really have to be able to connect and work together. So we can move on to the next. At sprint planning, which, as we all know, is time boxed to 2 hours or less per week of sprint length, you want to create a sprint goal and a sprint backlog, because that focuses your life for the next sprint. And what the goal is what is all of the things in the sprint backlog add up to? Why are we doing what we're doing? How do we get there? And also in sprint planning, you have to make sure that your product backlog items meet your definition of ready, that they are ready to execute. Because, and this is something I see a lot, when people don't have a really strong definition of ready, someone picks up a story or product backlog item and then says, what does this mean? And then spends 3 days trying to figure out what exactly the product owner meant or the customer wanted. And so especially in a remote environment, you really want to make sure your backlog is really, really clear, that everyone knows what's in it and what it means and what the acceptance criteria are. Now, also, you want the sprint goal to be realistically achievable. Like, you want a big release goal, like we're going to deliver this big thing, but you want to make sure people have a goal each and every sprint, because that really does help focus the team on the problem to solve. Now, the next meeting in Scrum, or event in Scrum, is, of course, the daily Scrum. And this is, it's 15 minutes, but this is so important for remote teams, because it gives you a daily touch point. It's much better if people work together in swarm, as we've been saying, but it gives you a daily touch point to check in with the rest of your team. What we need to do in a remote situation is really make sure that we get the value out of it. Speaking about the sprint goal, speaking to your team members. And again, it is a way of bringing people together, because you have this thing every day that brings you to your office, to your work, to your team members. And in a remote situation, this is even more important. And I would, Scrum Masters out there, be really careful, because people will start dropping this because they feel alone. They don't even know when they're supposed to go to work. So really make sure you're checking in. Then, of course, moving on, you want to talk about, a parking lot, you encourage this kind of conversation. As a Scrum Master, you should be saying, how can I help two people talk after the daily Scrum? So again, that you're building connection. And as a Scrum Master, you really want to try to build connection consciously, because it's easier to do if everyone's in the same room. And so as a Scrum Master, you should be thinking about, how do I build connection between two people, even if they're working on disparate things? How do we make sure people are talking to each other?
For my team, this parking lot is kind of like the water cooler conversation that you would have if you were in the same building. So it's really helpful.
And then, of course, we have the sprint review. Because when you're done, everyone knows what happens in a sprint review. You do the demo, but in a remote context, it's even more important, because you're showing what you've got done to the stakeholders, even just the product owner, but it gives you a sense of completion. And humans really like meaningful work and a sense of working together and a sense of getting something done. So make sure, again, you get that feedback, because you don't want your team in a remote situation feel like they're working in a vacuum, that they're not delivering something of value, that no one really cares what they're delivering. So you want to make sure that you get the right stakeholders, hopefully stakeholders outside the team, so they can give them that feedback, so they can figure out if they're making the right stuff. Then, of course, we have the sprint retrospective. And the sprint retrospective in a remote team is even more important. As I mentioned, what Ali Interactive is doing, and doing that kind of Kaizen thinking, because this is where people can talk about how they feel. And being quarantined by yourself in a world where there's a pandemic going on can be scary. It is scary. And you want to be able to talk about how that feels. And you need to have an event and a forum and a culture where people can be vulnerable. And to do that, you really need to make sure that your team is working together and feels that way. And then also they get to figure out what is blocking them. What is making this remote work hard? Let's fix something every sprint, or more than every sprint if you can. And that should be the top priority for the Scrum Master, making sure that there's a frictionless communication path. And the idea behind the sprint retrospective is change for the better. So if you don't do this retrospective, your team, especially in a remote team, is so easy for them to flatline. So you want to make sure they're doing experiments every sprint and trying to get better, because in a remote team, again, doing that experiment, working together to solve a problem about how hard it is to work together, that's what's going to give you the increase in velocity, even if in a remote situation. It is difficult. I'm not saying it isn't. It does require discipline, but it can happen, and you can have the same kind of productivity as you did when you're all in the same office. So here's some of the fun retrospective tools that I've tried out. I'm sure there are other ones, Fun Retro, Parable, I'm sure there are a bunch of others. We do sometimes around the Nareva board, but there's a bunch of fun and free tools that you can do to have a spark conversation and spark retrospectives. These are just the ones I've tried. I'm sure there are other ones, and I see people are talking about it in the chat of other tools that you can try and figure out. But we found some way of engaging your team in a remote way, because again, if you're having a retrospective when everyone's sitting around the same table, you can really feel all together. But doing it remotely, you have to, Scrum Masters, you need to find new tricks, new tools, and new ways of doing it to make sure everyone is heard. Jeff? Oh, let me just start this. And this is, I forgot I was going to say something here. So if you're not in this situation yet, right? You haven't had you haven't had coronavirus force you into self-isolation. I would really recommend, highly recommend, trying it now. Send everyone home for a day to see what the problems are going to be. Start figuring out what tool you're going to use. Start figuring out what your team working agreement is going to be. Is it going to be always on video, or is it just for the events? What is it going to be? Figure it out. And so you want to try to do this now when it's a lot easier. If you're not fully remote because you have the fortune of not being affected by the coronavirus, I really would encourage you, don't wait to figure it out on the fly.
If you look at the research we've done on distributed remote teams, making it feel like you're on the same team requires getting the same tooling for the team wherever they are in the location. And some of the companies we work with, they actually have the same color walls and paintings on the wall in the buildings, just so it feels the same no matter where you are. But getting that environment set up so it feels right might take a little work if you haven't done it.
I've been seeing in the chat that someone's recommending
this is
OWL.
particularly important. Say that again, JD?
I was just saying, I see in the chat that someone was recommending OWL cameras, which are totally kind of scary AI kind of things where it really allows people to feel and it sort of follows the speaker in the room and stuff like that. And I've used them a couple times and I found them kind of cool. Anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah. Scaling with remote teams requires careful attention. You need to, we showed you a company-wide meeting that we have every week. It's really a scaled event for the company where we can roll up we can see what everybody's doing. We can see what the problems are. Anything that comes up there rolls up into our executive action team, which is really the operational leadership team for the company. And that's critical for having a scaling implementation that works, is a leadership team that is agile and understands how to run an agile organization. Also on the product owner side, you're going to have teams of product owners with chief product owners, and they're going to have to work together to where the chief product owner is setting the high level strategic backlog, and the team level product owners are figuring out how to flow that into teams. And at the top of the company, there needs to be a meeting of that product owner team with the key leaders in the company where they can address the direction of the company, they can make changes, they can pivot quickly. So what's happening at Scrum Inc. right now with the coronavirus, we're pivoting to a lot of online types of work. There needs to be a lot of upgraded courses. There's a lot of work, there's a lot of decisions. We're actually going to 2 Meta Scrum meetings a week to make sure that the company is all aligned on a direction that we're going in.
So I really want to say that there's a really interesting study I found when I wrote my last book, Social Ties and Susceptibility to the Common Cold. And here's what they did in this study, is they went and talked to people, like recruited hundreds of people, like 800 people, 1,000 people. And they said, rate yourself on 12 different dimensions and how much connection you have. Like, you know, how often do you talk to your spouse? How often do you talk to your family? Are you a member of a church group? Are you a member of a sports league? Are you a member, you know, all this, like, what are the different social connections you have? And then they exposed all of them to the common cold virus, a coronavirus. And what was really interesting was the ones with the least connections, the ones most isolated, got sicker. And more of them got sick. The immune system was impacted by the amount of connection people have. And so this Dr. Cohen, went into and said, well, what is it that all these social connections do? And he really came up with a really interesting thing, which I think Scrum tries to do. It is, people need a sense of purpose. Why do I exist? Who am I? Because we define ourselves in relationship with other people. And when you're alone, you really need to say, well, I do have a purpose. I do have a structure. I do have connection. And then a sense of meaning, that my work has value. A sense of security where I feel like I'm in a group of people that I'm safe with. A sense of self-worth. What I'm doing is important to other people. And a sense of belonging. And I found this study really, really interesting because this is what we need to make sure happens in a remote world. And so as Jeff was saying about leadership and the pivoting, so last week, basically on last Tuesday, I think it was, we said we have to pivot as an entire company, and everything we had prioritized is going out the window, and we're going to start doing remote. How do we support people in a remote space, because that's what they are? And so we set that in a meta scrum, and then I had to go do an engagement, and my chief product owner sort of saw a lot of it through, and then and then the product owners at lower levels were aligned around a common backlog. We're doing meta scrums twice a week because things were changing so fast, and we started to. And then I went to the scaled demo yesterday, and I've been heads down at a client in the UK, so I have not been really in connection with. I've been in connection with my team, but not the rest of the company as much as I should. And the person who, my chief product owner, had flown because of a family emergency, so he had to go. And so he'd asked another product owner to step into the role as chief product owner. She got really sick. And so one of the other product owners stepped up into the chief product owner role without even talking to me about it. They self-organized and continued doing this pivot with zero input from me. I gave the intent last week, and the entire organization spun around it remotely, because they're all spread out, to come together. So I think that that is something that's really important, and make sure that you do this. And if you're a leader, even if you're not on their team, I've been, reach out to the people on your teams, check in with them. How are they doing? Give them a sense that the leadership of your organization does care about individual team members. So it's really take an active role. So I think we can go.
Okay. Here's a really cool tool that I helped work on with a European company. They have a subsidiary in India, and for their teams that are remotely, they have this tool which has the video always on. So you walk in, if it's nighttime there won't be anybody there. You can see, if it's working hours, you can see who's there, you can see what they're doing. They can stand up and talk to you. You can flip into other videos to go to meetings. One of the things I really liked about this team is I told them, they asked me about KPIs, and I said, the most important KPI is process efficiency. And that is really about how fast does a story get done when you pick it up. And we have research papers that show if your real work time divided by the clock time is over 50%, you're not only a lean organization, but your productivity more than doubles. And this team demonstrated that. And you can see in their tool, they have process efficiency right at the top. They're measuring it every sprint. They're watching everything they're doing.
So what we want to wrap up with, and we're going to answer questions in just a second, is that the last value of the Agile Manifesto: respond to change over following a plan. We all know that the world is changing and moving at an incredibly rapid rate, and it's just made more stark by this pandemic. And one of the things that Scrum is for is working in an unknown world. We don't know what's going to happen. Just as we're building a backlog, we don't know what's going to happen in the marketplace. So you want to make sure that what your Scrum teams are resilient, that it's not just trying to do as good as they can, but through continuous improvement, that adversity that can make you think clearer, to really struggle with a problem and make your team stronger. And one of the ways you do that is it's not just to survive change, it's being able to make your team better, or teams. So what I would really like to ask is, if you start working remotely, say, if you have been because of COVID or because of other reasons, what about tomorrow? What will happen if you start working remotely tomorrow? And what metrics are you going to gather to test your assumptions about remote work? How are you going to know whether your remote work is being successful? how your people are feeling and the morale of your people. And I'm really interested when this passes, because it will, is how are you going to adapt your organization in the future? If this really works out or doesn't, and by measuring those metrics, you can get some sense of it, how are you going to adapt your organization? Because I think this is a moment that some organizations are going to fundamentally shift. Will they go back to people coming to the office? I'm sure. But all of a sudden, we are being forced to develop new capability, which I find really interesting. I'm really fascinated to see what comes out of this. And I think I want to end with something that we learned, and I was reading about today in the Alley Interactive blog, our completely remote client. And it was, when you're physically in this space, you announce your presence by being physically there. But if you're remote, you have to announce your presence in an active way. You can't be passive about it. And so really get your teams to think that way. I have to make sure I'm felt as here, that people see me as here, that what I'm working on is transparent. And so if you're interested in more of this, we're coaching a lot of organizations right now. We're actually doing team launches remotely. It's really kind of crazy which we've done a few times, but this is really a innovation period for us. And we've done a lot of this. So please, write us at scrumquestions@scruminc.com. We're going to post this webinar. We'll also, be answering questions. We'll be sending out the checklist of tooling and, how the Scrum events you can really work. So with that, Tom, I'm seeing the chat go wild, but I haven't been, obviously can't be reading all of it. Do you see any questions that we can ask in the time remaining?
Absolutely. We've got a ton of questions, and thank you, everybody. The first thing I want to note, which I think is absolutely amazing and I've never seen before, we actually have participants in this call, in this webinar from all 6 populated continents. So welcome, everybody. Which leads me really to a first question, but actually, I do want to say this first. I have seen a few people mention the fact that they're not seeing JJ right now, which is an absolutely fair observation. In transparency, we asked him to turn off his video because he is doing this remotely from a hotel. And as everybody knows who's had hotel internet, sometimes it's great, sometimes it's not. And we'd rather be able to make sure you can hear what he has to we'd rather make sure you can hear what he has to say than to have those audio dropouts and leave some questions. So that's why we don't have JJ visible. But let's get to the fact that we have a lot of questions about time zones and dealing with distributed teams across different time zones. So specifically, in a distributed sense, how would you, what baseline advice would you give to people who are trying to figure out how to best coordinate teams across multiple time zones, possibly different continents?
Well, if you look at the research paper we've done, from Europe to India, there's a lot of overlap, so it's not a big problem. But one of the studies we did was from India to San Francisco, which is 12 and a half hours. And that's the maximum problem. And what we showed in that paper is that you could get extremely high production by just juggling the events a little bit and figure out a way to organize so the teams could stay feeling connected, working together. And describing exactly what happened is more time than we have right now. But if you go to that paper, it's about distributed Scrum between San Francisco and India, and it's on the Scrum Inc. website.
Thank you, Jeff. Another common theme that we're seeing here deals with something you kind of touched on briefly with one of the slides, which is people who are used to working with physical boards, not tooling, but physical boards. How best can you share those boards when you may have a partially or a fully distributed team?
Well, I've seen it done a couple different ways. One way is you have your boards virtualized. The other way is have Post-its. Sometimes I do this in my office, is have the Post-its just have a webcam on it. Or I'll take a snapshot of it and put it in a chat tool like Slack or Microsoft Teams or whatever. And what I do personally, I have my backlog. I talk to my team remotely, and then I put the backlog up physically, in my office on the wall, And every daily Scrum, I move it around so I know where things are. And not just my work, I put all the work. It takes me what, 15 minutes or 10 minutes, even less, to do this. And then, I just check the tool once or twice a day, and it allows me to move those. Physical boards are great. I think they're the best way to go. As we've been talking about, and what I've really been impressed by is the conversation going on in the chat. And again, I can only see a little bit of it, is people helping other people, recommending tools, recommending practices. Hey, have you checked this out? That is incredibly valuable. And it speaks to me what the community of Scrum is helping each other and giving each other learnings. I just want to say, I've seen, we'll send out a link to all the papers we're talking about in the post-webinar email, and as well as the checklist, so you can find it.
Thank you, JJ. Another theme that we're seeing a lot of, it's a real tactical thing, but it is something that sometimes has some cultural ramifications, and it may just be a new way of people to think about it. And it has to do with the camera. So a number of people have asked, how do you get people to turn on their camera when they rather not?
In my experience, and I totally understand that, if people would rather not, say, well, you got to turn it on for the daily Scrum. You got to turn it on for if we're working together. And I think that if you're suddenly remote, is that one of the things you first need to do is work out a team working agreement. We have a pretty cool canvas that one of our consultants, Avi Schneier, put together for building a team working agreement on our blog. I'll put a link to that as well in the email. But you have to figure out, and Scrum Masters, do this right away. Okay, we're now remote. What are our working agreements? And maybe it's video some of the time. Maybe it's video, and maybe it's video none of the time. Maybe that's just impossible. But I would highly recommend that you do video when you're working together or attending the Scrum events.
I'd like to focus now on some of the questions we have about the Scrum events, specifically 2 Scrum events. The first is the retrospective. It's a chance to look at the process as much as anything. For a new distributed teams, a group of remote workers who are now in this situation for the first time, what should they do to focus in? How can we help them focus in to make sure they are making the right observations and using the retro in the right way? And then the second part on that is, what about for more experienced teams?
A good retro requires a good Scrum Master. And I would say one of the things I would recommend is not wait till the retro to talk to everybody, Scrum Masters, is talk to everybody every day. I think I would put that on your calendar. I'm going to talk to people on this team every day. Just checking in outside, just one-on-one. So you get a sense of the team, both in the daily Scrum, but also, you get a sense of them one-on-one. And then by doing that, you can, as a Scrum Master, can bring that kind of distilled feedback to the retrospective. Hey, I've been talking to everybody, and this is what I've been hearing people are struggling with. Here are the commonalities. Does everyone agree that that's something we should work on? And sort of really kind of prime the conversation, because it can be a little harder. With really experienced teams, wow, it's a lot easier, huh? And I would say try to replicate your process. Like, how do you do it now? How can you replicate it in the best fashion remotely? And there are a million ways of doing retrospectives, but really experienced teams, if you're used to being co-located, see how much you can replicate using video, using Miro is one of the tools, or FunRetro, or whatever they are. There are a ton of tools. Just make sure you pick the one that will work for you, but really try to replicate what works for you physically, virtually.
Jeff, I'd like this next question to go to you specifically. One of the big purposes, and I think sometimes it may get lost with the daily Scrum, is the ability to replan as necessary based on emergent conditions, events, or emergent work need.
Right.
How important is that in a situation like this, where you suddenly have distributed teams, and because of outside influences, something like a virus, the situation can be changing very quickly?
Right. Well, the whole thing about the daily Scrum is it's not a status report, although I've seen a lot of teams try to do it that way. It doesn't work. It's more like a football huddle. You have a short time to kind of resync and change the play. And in the remote setting, it's no different than it is if you're in the same room. maybe even more important. So figuring out what everybody's doing and how people can help one another and how they can fill in if someone may be sick or not available, making those adjustments quickly. And in the remote setting, it's not only that piece, but as I said, the parking lot after is a way to get the kind of discussion you would have if you're co-located, so that the team really feels connected. So it's the daily meeting and the parking lot are really important for remote teams.
I mean, one thing we do at Scrum Inc., which I really like, is that, you know, every few weeks, once a month at the longest, everyone gets together for a happy hour virtually. And you have, you know, dozens of people just having a beer together in a virtual setting. And that, you know, creates this camaraderie that is really, really nice. You're getting together to talk not about work, but it's checking, hey, how's your dog doing? What you doing this weekend? That kind of stuff, where it's a purposeful creation of culture. This might happen naturally if you're all together. But if you're looking at this, you want to say, how do I create culture? And it's not solely the Scrum events. You want to make sure people are connecting with each other, even if they're not on the same team. So it still feels like a team of teams. So it still feels like we're all in this together. And I think that's critically important.
We've had a number of questions about any changes to the role of Scrum Master. And JJ, I know that you've mentioned the importance of the Scrum Master role, but I'm wondering for both of you gentlemen, what advice do you have, or what would you suggest a Scrum Master with a newly distributed team, what is it that they should focus on?
Well, the Scrum Master really needs to get to know the team. And if you look at the papers on well-implemented distributed remote teams, were very successful implementations, there's usually some bringing of the team together physically, at least at the beginning, and sometimes on a regular cadence every quarter or something like that. And for sure, I would recommend the Scrum Master. So for example, I had a Scrum Master in Denver who had a team in the UK. And I was coaching that Scrum Master, and he was having some difficulty. And I was like, you know, you need to go to the UK and spend a sprint or two there, because that team is not going to stay on the rails. And sure enough, he didn't do that, and then he got in real trouble. So the Scrum Master has to do what needs to be done, connecting with those people, and he needs to go to the people. So some of our Scrum Masters in Europe visited the teams in India. And one of the things they found is that some of their events were being scheduled at 9 or 10 o'clock at night in India. And that was the time when the Indian families all got together for dinner. And so by being in dinner with the Indian family, they realized, hey, you know, we need to have our Scrum events outside of this family time in India. So by being there, you know, you not only connect, but you realize how to make things work better.
That is absolutely the best way to do it. But if you can't, because, I don't know, there's a travel ban or something, you really, as a Scrum Master, here's the advice I would give. Try to keep the culture of the team alive. Instead of a chat tool, like, I know everyone uses a bunch of chat tools these days. Instead of asking a question in the chat tool, start calling people by video call. Make that the default choice when you're trying to communicate, and you encourage your team to do it. Hey, don't use the chat tool. Don't use email. Call them. Talk to them just like they would in the office. They'd step over and speak with them. Try to make that part of your daily routine and encourage that kind of communication style. And as a Scrum Master, you can say, hey, let's try this, but also do it yourself and model the behavior. Oh, we're having a conversation. We need somebody else. We'll pull someone else in.
We have just a few, about less than a minute left. I want to remind everyone, we're not going to be able to answer everyone's questions. Please reach out to us. You have the email on the screen. Visit us at scruminc.com, and we will do our best to answer your emails. Or if you would like some help, obviously contact us. Gentlemen, we've had questions about metrics. I'm assuming that with distributed teams and with co-located teams, the metrics remain the same. Track happiness, make sure everyone, track productivity to make sure, or velocity rather, to make sure everybody knows that they're going forward in the right way, and share priorities and give context. Am I missing anything there?
No, but I think having some metrics around remote teams, we have found, particularly in the venture group, where we have about 50 companies operational at any time, and every single company has teams in various parts of the world. We cannot run a $1 billion investment pool unless we have a sense of how well the teams are doing in different locations within the companies. And that actually drives decisions at the board level, having that information.
And I would, go ahead, Dan.
And even if you're just down at the Scrum Master level, it's going to be hard for you to understand as a Scrum Master how things are working unless there's some kind of transparent metrics that give you a signal that, you know, maybe the team needs more help from you.
I think I would agree, and that the really important thing, just like any team, what is the measure of success of a remote team? How are you going to say this team is successful or this team is not? And really pay attention to that. And it, you know, maybe it's the same as they were when they're co-located, maybe it's not. But decide what victory looks like and say, this is where we're going, this is what we want to achieve.
We have hit our time box. We've actually gone over a little bit. I want to thank everyone for being here. Just a quick reminder too, if you have questions, reach out to us. We're here to help. That's why this webinar is free and why we're doing it now. If you want to learn more about distributed teams or virtual coaching or anything else, just email us at scrum-questions@com or go to www.scruminc.com. Jeff Sutherland and JJ Sutherland, I want to thank you both very much for the time, and I'd like to thank everyone for being here. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, and please stay safe and stay healthy.
Yeah.